And so when you rap on them, they would ring all over. You could hear it all over. And whenever the streets would get crowded and Caganills wanted to clear the street, he'd rap his mace on their poles and they'd ring, they'd hear them ring, you'd see the street clear. they would clear off the street.
Now look towards the back row, second in from the left. That's Oliver Mason. On the street, they called him Two-Gun Mason.
Ollie Mason. He'd shoot you about 8 or 9 times after it hurt. You were allowed to carry one revolver, supposed to be nothing over a 45. Oliver carried 2 magnums. One time they called him in on the carpet for carrying a machine gun. Nobody knew where he got it from. Oliver used to always say, you know good dead. He didn't believe in giving them a chance to kill him. He said if they weren't doing wrong, they wouldn't get shot.
But as tough as Ollie Mason was in keeping order on the streets of the Hill, he took care of its residents in other ways, too.
He had in his car, his trunk of his car was full of bicycle parts and bicycle tools. And he used to ride along, and if he saw a kid with a bike, he would stop him and oil the bike up, tighten it up, and maybe if he saw something wrong with the pedals are bad, he'd take the pedal off and put a new pedal on. Free of charge, he'd just do this. He just loved to help the kids.
He was respected as one of our better police, and if Mr. Mason told you, no, you don't do it, then you didn't do it.
It's strange that the wonderful things that blacks have done down through the years, nobody mentions them, and they're not remembered, just like they didn't exist. There was not a policeman in Pittsburgh that ever been, as far as I know, in the history that I've read of Pittsburgh, that could compare with Oliver Mason.
The Hill was a different place then. Violent crime and burglary were relatively rare.
This was the atmosphere that existed in the Hill at that time. You didn't have to worry about somebody knocking you in the head or robbing you or jumping on you, insinuating that you had no business in the Hill or anything like that. This didn't exist at that time. People were not afraid to come to the Hill.
But there was illegal activity along Wylie Avenue. After-hours clubs, prostitution, and the numbers. The numbers game was like an unofficial lottery. Controlling the numbers racket was lucrative, and the men who wrote the numbers became the Hill's financial tycoons. They also became the Hill's folk heroes.
We had 2 people that we had to depend on in those days, and that was the ministers and the number writers.
Probably the most honest and trustworthy people that ever came through the Pittsburgh area were your numbers writers. And for the Hill District, the numbers writers were not organized crime. The numbers writers were not criminals. Okay, the numbers writers were your uncle and your cousin Joey, and it went all across, again, the ethnic lines.
It's interesting to note that the police, or the killjoys in blue as we call them, rarely arrested people that were engaged in numbers. They were hard on shoplifters and street fighting and crap games in the middle of the street and things like that, but never numbers because it meant so much to unemployed people. See, 1 penny could win you $7.
2 of the most famous numbers writers were Woogie Harris, the owner of Woogie's Crystal Barbershop, and Gus Greenlee, who owned the Crawford Grill, among other things.
If you talk to 100 people about Gus and Woogie, 99 of them will have very favorable things to say about them. They were that kind of individuals. They were dynamic, they were generous, they were compassionate, but they made their money in illegal business. The numbers, in fact, it's alleged that in 1925, when Gus Greenlee came to Pittsburgh, that he brought the numbers with him.
Some of our professional men, doctors and lawyers, set up their offices with loans from them. And remember, there wasn't anything, in my opinion, there wasn't anything wrong with it when the banks wouldn't loan you money.
They were illegal, but they still had them, and I mean, they made a lot of money. They were respected, because I'll tell you why. They did a lot of good for the community. They were not men who made money and kept it in their pocket.
The Digitarians, as they were called, put their money into civic events, political campaigns, and helped neighbors in hard times. But they may best be remembered for fostering the development of America's favorite pastime. Gus Greenlee built his own ballpark called Greenlee Field. His team was the Pittsburgh Crawfords. Along with the Homestead Grays, another local Negro team, they soon carved a name for themselves in baseball lore.
They beat every team in sight. And we used to stop off there at the grill at night just to sit and talk with them. And that's where the story originated. Satchel Paige said that Cool Papa Bell was so fast that he could turn the switch of the light and get in bed before the light went out. But that didn't impress me as much as the one Oscar Charlton said, that's slow. Said when he was coming up, he was so fast that he would hit a single down the right field line and the ball would hit him as he rounded first going to second base. Now that's really motoring.
The Pittsburgh Crawfords were known around the nation. Both they and the Grays were prominently featured in the national editions of the Pittsburgh Courier. The Crawfords and the Grays provided a recreational outlet for the Hill. Look how dressed up everybody was for the games. That's Gus Greenlee in the stands.
They had the skill to compete probably with anyone, but they really put on a show. The home run hitter was intimidating, and he got up there like Mike Tyson with an intimidating expression. Third baseman might get up and do a dance before swinging at the ball. It was a form of entertainment as well as watching good sport.
The Negro Leagues had great players. They sometimes played in the big league parks, and every now and then they played against white major leaguers, and usually won.
To me, it was a great time. We didn't realize how great it was at the time that we lived through that, but it was a great time.
The Hill also turned out for the sport of boxing. There were Golden Gloves fights and world championships. The 1951 heavyweight championship fight between Jersey Joe Walcott and Ezzard Charles was at Forbes Field. It drew the largest fight crowd in Pittsburgh history, but the local boxers were still the favorites.
Charlie Burley was probably one of the best boxers of all time. I know that Fritzie refused to fight him, and I also know Sugar Ray Robinson refused to fight him. He could box. He was an excellent boxer.
There was a time, if you had to find someone and he wasn't taking in a boxing match or a baseball game, chances are he would be hanging out at a barber shop on Wylie Avenue.
Hey, what's going on here? Who are these people?
Today, Archie's Place on Fifth Avenue is a descendant of those barbershops. This is the owner and head barber, Archie Creighton.
I classify our barber's job as tops. He might not be rich, but he sure has got a classic job. Because everybody got to take his hat off, to whether he like you or not. He got to take his hat off.
When Archie was starting out as a barber, he worked in one of the most famous shops on the Hill, Woogie Harris's Crystal Barbershop.
You see all the celebrities from every which way from all over the world. Everybody knew him. And they would come in, you got a chance to see a lot of folks you never would have seen, ordinarily.
Today's haircuts may look different from the 40s, but Archie sees a lot of similarities.
They got different names for it, but the base is the same haircut. Like the High English, that's the old haircut. Now they got it, they call it the boxers. Ain't nothing but the High English. We used to laugh at folks with them. And now this one got to be popular. That's what it is now. Check that out and see how you like it.
Other styles are gone, though. There used to be a homemade mixture for straightening your hair called concholine. If it wasn't used right, it would burn your scalp so badly you would end up temporarily bald.
White potatoes and bread and lye, and you made it together in grease. And during that time, people wasn't too slick on doing it, and they didn't know how to grease the head, and they just stick it right on the head, and the hair plaster your head, and you wash your head, the whole thing come off.
It's like the scorched earth. I'm telling you.
Some of the people in Archie's Place remember when Wylie Avenue was the place to go on a date.
Friday or Saturday nights used to be an occasion. Everybody would have on their Sunday best. Go out to bars all over the Hill The girls would look beautiful, and the fellas, I won't say they look beautiful, but they look real nice.
You used to be able to walk in a bar. If you wanted a drink, you could leave your money on the bar and go to the bathroom and come back and still be there when you come back.
The most important thing was getting the girl out of her mother and father's house. Because you had your own options once you did that.
One of the most popular options was to go out dancing, and one of the most popular steps was called trucking.
You put your hand on your hip, then you trucking.
Yeah.
Home trucking my blues away. You put your hand on your hip and your finger up and go across the floor. That was something like that, something simple.
Wylie Avenue had plenty in the way of nightlife. The stars really came out at night on the hill.
Just about anybody who was playing music at that time came here. I know Jack McDuff, who played the organ at Birdie's place, George Kirby, Billy Eckstein. Everybody who was anybody who came to town came to the Crawford Grill. Joe Lewis, all of those people came into the area. Lena Horne, quite a few of them would come in through that area because this was home for them.
People came from all over town. And the theaters up here, we had a lot of the white people, in fact, 99% white. And all the nightclubs, they were 99% white. I mean, they came up for service in the evening. And we might relate to Wylie Avenue as you would in some parts of New York, like in Harlem.
He's not exaggerating. In this photo, taken in Pittsburgh, here's Sarah Vaughan, Billy Eckstein, and Dizzy Gillespie. Billy Eckstein's big band often played here, featuring musicians like Art Blakey, John Coltrane, and Dexter Gordon. And here's Cab Calloway in town for an engagement.
There were private clubs, the big-time entertainers. It had the reputation that between New York and Chicago, that was the place to be. You had to either go to Chicago or to New York to find more.
Big bands like Artie Shaw, Count Basie, and Duke Ellington would play downtown and then head to an after-hours club in the Hill. The Crawford Grill No. 2 was a jazz mecca in the 50s, and the Musicians Club was also a favorite hangout.
We had Tommy Dorsey there one night playing trombone against two trombone players locally here. And after the session, he went up to the grill, and the food was so good, he overindulged and got stomach burns. And Cy Oliver, who'd formerly played with Jimmy Lunsford, he took him right up to the Good's drugstore, and Bill Good mixed him up a concoction that settled his stomach, and he never forgot him. He always remembered. Drugstore in Pittsburgh had saved his life, so he claimed. He just overate, that's all.
Sarah Harley, along with her husband George, owned the Celebrity Cafe. She says that back then, nightlife was the chief form of entertainment.
People used to bar hop. They'd start down at the Grill No. 1 down in Deep Wylie, work their way up to Stanley's at Fullerton Street, come up to our place and work their way on up to Heron Avenue. That was a Saturday night ritual. Well, Art Blakey worked for us, and that's before he got on big time. He used to play a piece called X-Lax and Lima Beans. And I was on the 3rd floor and had this brass bed, and the bed would just jingle whenever he hit the drums. I knew exactly what he was playing.
Henry Belcher is a tap dancer. He performed in some of those floor shows at the Celebrity. That's him on the right, still dancing today. He says Pittsburgh was a valuable training ground before taking your act on the road.
People started telling us, you should go to New York, you should go to New York. But I told them, boy, I said, no, we're not ready to try to go to New York. Because you go to New York, and if you're not ready, you're coming back from New York right fast.
They capitalized on the Mahatma Gandhi craze and named themselves the Three Mad Magandhis. After working the Pittsburgh club circuit for a couple of years, Henry got to live his dream of performing at the world-famous Apollo Theater.
That week they had the Battle of Dancers. They had us on the bill with the Four Step Brothers. They was nationally known all over though. But we went in there, we held our own anyway. But after that, I mean, we were considered New Yorkers then. And everywhere we went then, across the country, we were from New York. We wasn't from Pittsburgh.
In 1948, everyone turned their ears and their radio dials to the Mary D. Show. Mary D. was WHOD's hottest DJ. WHOD called itself the Station of Nations because each 15-minute block of programming was dedicated to one of Pittsburgh's ethnic groups. But there was no black show. Mary D. figured it was high time for that to change and approached WHOD's manager.
He told her if she could get some people to advertise for him so that they could pay her salary, then they would give her the job. Well, she came back and she had those people. And right after that, she got so many different advertisers. They gave her a short time. After that, Mary had like three or 4 hours.
Mary took her roving microphone into the community. She did a morning show with her brother, Mal Good, who later became the first black correspondent for ABC News, and a show with her daughter called Teenage Express, Moving Around with Little D.
She had Moving Around with Mary D, and she broadcast from the window. And she had to, she was in the window, and the kids, Shenley High School was up the street, and Heron Hill was there. And in the afternoon, you would see all these kids around that window watching her. And if they had put their name up there, she'd say their name on the radio, and that was the greatest thing for them.
Mary D. popularized black music to a larger audience. But perhaps Mary D.'s most enduring gift to Pittsburgh was the name she gave to the corner of Fullerton and Wylie.
Mary said, if you come up here to this corner, it's a crossroads of the world. You can go from Stanley's to Goods to the after-hours spot and never miss a beat. And that's how she named it, Crossroads of the World. And people did come from everywhere.
This is what the Crossroads of the World looks like now. The parking lot for the Civic Arena was built over it. But even today, Florence Bridges is still flooded by memories when she stands where the crossroads used to be.
There was so much vitality. There were people everywhere. On that corner was Goods Pharmacy. There was a musicians club. The Washington clubs were over there, the Lolanda clubs. Right there was an old theater called the Rumba Theater. It was a murky theater. It didn't even have a ticket agent. You'd pay your money and then you would go in. They would wave you in. And nobody ever admitted they went to the Rumba Theater. Everybody went in like spies. But they would have the movies after everybody else had the movies. And you would go in, and when your eyes became accustomed to the dark, you'd look around, you'd see everybody you ever knew.
The Rumba Theater and everything else in the Lower Hill was doomed the day the city opened this urban redevelopment office in the late 50s. As they tore down the theaters, businesses, and housing, an entire way of life began to come apart. Wylie Avenue days were coming to a close.
Of course, that just destroyed everything. See, urban renewal always means Negro removal. It doesn't help us any. It might help the city, but doesn't help the minorities at all.
This is one of the most devastating things that ever happened to the black community, was to tear out the Lower Hill, the way it was done. There was no consideration given to where the black people were going to go, what was going to happen to black businesses.
Thousands of people were displaced just to build the Civic Arena. All of Wylie Avenue below Crawford Street, the part that went to the jail, was destroyed.
Well, I'll tell you, it was a sad feeling when I seen all them buildings going down.
The Jewish people went one direction, the Italian people went another direction, and the poor colored people didn't have much choice to go but wherever they could.
Those people who were uprooted with businesses and people who had homes, I doubt if they were compensated for what they gave up and what they lost.
The wrecking crews knocked down the economic base that fueled the Hill. At the same time, the bonds of segregation and discrimination were loosening. As people were forced out of their homes, they left the Hill. Living conditions for those who remained started to slide. Kayla Roy Irvis has lived in the Hill since 1945.
The people whom I knew have been moved out, driven out, bulldozed out, sent elsewhere. The problem is, elsewhere was any place they could find. Elsewhere hadn't been prepared for them. So those wonderful new buildings with their glittering facades really were, as I said, monuments to the destruction of a community.
The demolition might have gone further, but the Hill fought back and held the line at Crawford Street. This corner outside St. Benedict the Moor Church became the rallying point. People started calling it Freedom Corner.
The community took a stand here and said, you will no longer take away our housing to put up commercial development. Development will stop here until there's housing provided. From that point on, every parade, every protest, anything of social significance in the city has always started right here on Freedom Corner at the steps of the church.
Then, in 1968, after the death of Martin Luther King, the Hill, along with other neighborhoods across the nation, was ravaged by riots.
We were on our way to church that Sunday morning. It was Palm Sunday, I'll never forget, and I was pregnant with my youngest. And it was just terrible seeing these places torn up and seeing people running with shoes and clothing and food that they weren't going to use. And I think that was just the end of businesses.
Local people did not start the riot. You know how a riot is. Once it starts, everybody gets into it, but local people didn't start the riot. But in anger, you do a lot of things that you don't do when you're rational. See, they were bitter about unemployment and about the way they were being mistreated here.
The riots devastated the Hill. By the time the fires burned out, Wylie Avenue days were only a memory.
Well, those of you that have never seen it really missed something, because the Hill at that time was a very, very, very fine place to be.
Rackets, religion, lawyers, doctors, and the best economic progress we ever had occurred right there on Wylie Avenue. It brings back pleasant memories.
People were poor, but I don't think that they knew they were poor because they were enriched in so many other ways. People were willing to share what little bit they might have had.
I miss the realness, the genuineness of the Hill District and the people who were there. They were real. They were people who cared about you. They were people who were concerned about you. It was like a family.
The Hill was just a real sweet and nostalgic part of my life. I would wish that everybody could have had a Hill to have grown up in.